Thank you so much, Hallie. And I am really glad to be here with everyone. This is an incredibly interesting, exciting, and timely topic. And I just cannot wait to engage in a conversation with our two amazing speakers. We're going to jump right into the discussion as we want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So first, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Missy Cummings. She is at Duke University, and she's the director of the Humans and Autonomy Laboratory. So a very important topic, as AI increasingly is everywhere in our lives. This notion of bringing together humans and autonomy is more and more important. She's also one of Navy's first female fighter pilots. So forgive my language, a general badass. And has been recently commenting quite a bit on what are some of the potential limitations of artificial intelligence as we continue to transition the technology into practice. Our second speaker is Dr. Eric Horvitz. Eric is Technical Fellow and Chief Scientific Officer at Microsoft. He has been a long leader in artificial intelligence field, and I've crossed paths with Eric over the last probably 15 years or so, back on the DARPA Information Science and Technology Study Group back about 10 years ago. He also received the Feigenbaum and the Alan Newell Prizes for contributions in artificial intelligence, and particularly relevant to our discussion today, served as a commissioner on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. So right from there, I'm going to jump straight into the conversation. And I think, as most of the folks here are aware, AI has really been around for quite a bit. I personally have sort of had AI in my timeline for at least the last 2 decades. I was just looking this up this morning. I was a teaching assistant on CS 472 at Cornell University, which was artificial intelligence taught by Bart Selman using the Russell Norvig textbook. So clearly, artificial intelligence is not new, but there's significant energy and conversation around artificial intelligence. So I'm going to pass the first question to Eric and ask, why now? What is happening right now in this moment? And please also mention a little bit about the National Security Commission on AI report and why it's so timely.
Sure. Well, thanks, Nadya, for moderating today and for having me. AI refers to a constellation of technologies, not just one technology. The early framers of the AI field in the 1950s talked about trying to make machines solve the kinds of problems now reserved for humans. I like the definition that AI is the study of computational mechanisms underlying thought and intelligent behavior. Now, there's been a stream of really nice results and applications over the decades, but maybe 20 years ago, there was an inflection point. And this is where computation and memory rose very quickly in terms of resources. We have incredible data coming to researchers and developers through the digitalization of the world. And we actually did some great work in machine learning and reasoning prowess, the algorithms. On top of that, we have a competitive landscape. As these methods have gotten more valuable, they become very central at companies, and the competitive terrain actually kind of supercharges advances in some ways. Now, about 10 years ago, I'd say 10 and a half years ago, there was a disruption in capabilities, and this was the rediscovery that deep neural networks actually had much more power than we had expected. This discovery actually was made on the 3rd floor of the building that I spend time in at Microsoft Research when Jeff Hinton visited us, and we discovered that one of the founders of the field of deep neural nets, and we discovered that the neural networks had just been famished for decades for data, and now we had that data. But since that point in time, we've had achievements that are stunning. Object recognition reaching human parity in 2016, speech recognition, human parity 2017, a workload called that at Stanford for machine reading comprehension, reaching human parity by AI systems in January 2018, and just in the same year, a few months later, machine translation reaching human parity by AI systems. So you can imagine how these advances might be on the minds of government leaders, folks concerned about national security for the implications of these systems for in our hands versus in potential hands of adversaries. And in 2018, the National Defense Authorization Act passed by US Congress said we needed to create a committee or an independent commission. And the words they used were to consider the method and means necessary to advance the development of AI, machine learning, and associated technologies to comprehensively address the national security and defense needs of the US. And they pointed out a set of 10 objectives, essentially, and commissioned this study that I've been part of for 2 years, just reaching its final report on March 1st.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'd like to kind of jump off a little bit of this notion of human parity and the significant progress. So recently, Missy, you have published the paper, Rethinking the Maturity of AI in Safety Critical Settings. And also you've been very involved in the Computing Community Consortium's Assured Autonomy set of workshops. So can you comment a little bit about this particular moment in time in terms of the limitations of artificial intelligence and why it is so important to consider that, particularly at this inflection point?
So first, I want to thank you for having me. As a graduate student, I was very much an Eric Horvitz groupie, so it's fun to be on the call with him. And now I might, I'm a little worried that I'm going to step on his toes. So my apologies, Eric, if I say to annoy you.
It's more fun that way for the conversation, right?
You're such a great mentor. But yeah, so I've been very vocal about problems with AI because I come at this from first, I think I say a warfighter perspective. My history is such that as one of the first female fighter pilots, I got to see what happens when automation outpaces humans. And indeed, in the 3 years that I flew F-18 Hornets, on average, one person died a month because of poor human-machine interaction and a misunderstanding of how to design these systems. So I carry that motivation with me, which is, it's very helpful for me to stay focused. And so as I start to see technology outpace humans and we start to put more faith than the automation deserves, I start to get concerned. And you don't have to look very far in our history. The accident, the Tesla accident in Houston that killed the 2 men, I've been telling people for years that this is going to happen, and it did happen, and it's not a surprise. And for all of us who've been worried about the use of artificial intelligence in cars, which is a technology that touches almost everyone in America, then we need to start to realize that, yes, we've achieved some parity by some definition, but there are still huge gaps in not just the understanding of how people use the technologies, but the understanding of people who make the technologies. I call neural network based artificial intelligence, and we can talk about later, because there's a difference between good old-fashioned AI and neural nets. But neural nets are dark magic. They're dark magic because the people who are seeing the magic trick, the drivers of the cars, they don't understand the magic. And the bad news is the people who are making the algorithms also don't understand the magic. They don't know how the magic happens. And so when we've got some magic that we're creating that we don't fully understand how we're creating it, that's not a good thing.
Actually, let's just jump in here and say that I agree 100% with Missy's comments just now. When you hear about human parity reached on workload X, you can just imagine that it's going to be very important to figure out how we can harness such power. And typically it's done by thinking very carefully about specific applications, let's say on a smartphone for speech recognition, for example, or a translation application that might be used. When it comes to thinking about the broader applications of AI to augment human decision-making, to be used more generally in the open world, as I like to call it, we have to be very cautious about the brittleness of these systems. They just are deep and narrow and fragile. This doesn't mean that we can't think deeply about how we might harness various kinds of what I would say pattern recognition-based technologies and some certain kinds of decision-making technologies called reinforcement learning, some specific applications. but being very careful about where we apply them and about understanding the stakes, the robustness, the reliability, the appropriate training. And as Missy said, we are in the early days of human AI collaboration, the augmentation of human intelligence with AI systems, even how we just came up a call today, how radiologists should, for example, or other clinicians should even understand how to interpret a list of probabilities about diagnoses. We don't really understand how to mesh AI with human decision-making very well yet.
Can I start arguing already? Like we've totally gone off the rails, and now Eric and I are just going back and forth. I did want to make just a quick comment. And again, I totally agree with you, Eric. I would caution people, though, one of the areas of research that I'm looking in now is how does the subjectivity of the creator of the AI affect the outcomes of the AI? And one of the things I get really concerned about is this idea of reinforcement learning. From a mathematical perspective, it's great that we give technology rewards to seek states that we think are good and positive, but this is where technology becomes socially constructed. Who's making the choice about what the reward is? And certainly Microsoft, I mean, I don't want to bring up any bad memories, Tay, and, there have been other issues about, the AI. We create AI and we don't even realize how either our own biases or how our misunderstandings and or just not even considering the weakness of the assumptions that we're making, how that can propagate to end up in bad AI.
Yeah, and Nadya, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but I could address this also. I mean, but by defending Missy in her comment, not by defending myself. The National Security Commission on AI report, which can be read in full at nscai.gov, all 754 pages if you have patience, or you can just jump to the section on trustworthiness and reliability, chapter 7, or the civil liberties, civil rights, and privacy, chapter 8, to look at some of the kinds of things we cautioned readers and the United States agencies, government agencies, about AI. And this includes the idea that notions like fairness and various objective functions really need to be defined. And when you, there's not, for example, one definition of fairness, there's several, and that you could conjure up. And the comment is, if you're in a government agency using AI technologies for high stakes decisions or even low stakes decisions that are replicated en masse, it's really important to, if there is a definition of, like, let's say an objective or what fairness is, to be transparent about that objective, to work with the right multi-party stakeholders to develop these objectives, and then to test and continue to communicate about these assumptions in the systems and their implications.
So maybe if we can pull up a little bit, this is a great conversation, and I think actually like all of these points are in the question. So we're going through all of the questions already, which is fantastic. But we talked a little bit about the risks with, for example, autonomous vehicles. There are other potential threats and vulnerabilities in artificial intelligence systems. So maybe we can comment a little bit on some of those. So clearly this is a national security concern. This is a National Security Commission on AI report. So what are some of the vulnerabilities? And maybe I'll start with Missy. I know you're not the commissioner, but maybe we can start there. What do you see as some of the other vulnerabilities of the systems and threats?
Well, and I've mentioned a lot of them before. I think we have vulnerability in the making of the magic. We don't, I tell people this all the time. I'm never getting into a self-driving car that any of my students ever program. And that is because I know just what bad mistakes they make. And one of the things I see as a professor is that students will often, when they find out, when I bring them in to do a machine learning, neural network, deep learning project, and they find out how much time they have to spend cleaning the data and preparing it and checking assumptions, I'm not kidding when I say I've had multiple students just quit because they don't want to take the time to invest what it's going to take to make decent AI that you can have some faith in. And so that worries me, because if I'm struggling to hold students' attention to make them go through this laborious, tedious process, how much of this is happening in the real world when companies are under deadlines and the desire to make money, right? So we can imagine that you're not going to take the same time to check all your assumptions. So I think the creation of the AI is on one side. And then I worry about the overhype. And then, and it's, in some ways, it's kind of sweet. People just want to desperately believe that there is some magic out there. And I think that's sweet in the sense that we want to believe that there's just something so magical that it's going to revolutionize our lives. And indeed, our smartphones, they seem magical to us. And this is one of the reasons they've been so successful. That desire for magic and something beyond us that I think that we're seeing in the self-driving community. I mean, this has just turned out to be incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous because now a lot of companies are going into the sunk cost bias, where they've spent so much money that if they don't make it happen, then there's a lot of egg on their face and lost money. And then, so we only dig that hole even deeper. I think in the next 1 to 2 years, you're going to see a serious change in what's happening in the self-driving community. That's not to say that there's no market for it, but the market is going to end up being local deliveries, slow speed shuttles. We're going to have something good that comes out of all that technology, but it's not going to be on the scale that all the venture capitalists want it to be. And when that happens, I do worry that we're going to have some kind of backlash like we've seen before historically for people who are doing this kind of work.
Let me just add.
So hang on one second. So I'm really interested in this discussion in terms of producers versus consumers. And there was something, so I've been paying attention to the NSCAI public meetings, and something Commissioner Clyburn actually said really stuck with me was this notion of not just AI workforce, but AI people force. So an educated populace that understands the limitations. If Eric, maybe you can comment on that a little bit, and how do we get there? Because there isn't, it's not magic, it's not linear estimation, but if you haven't taken a class in linear estimation, it's magic. So how do we get there?
So the report and the commissioners were very concerned about AI understandings and training, whether it be the end users, the engineers building systems and testing them, as well as the general population, and government officials and bureaucrats that actually might be using these systems or relying on them. So we talked about multiple programs and the need for education for raising the bar on what people understand when it comes to core statistics, probability, data analysis, and so on. Now, I should say that there is, just to pivot a bit, the issues that Missy brought up were all very interesting: over hype, issues around fairness. Privacy is a very important issue to think deeply about, given that data is the fuel of modern AI systems. And there are some gray areas even today with government agency access to data about US civilians, for example, data that can be commercially purchased legally to this day. And the commission pointed out some potential directions for stopping those gaps. Now, I also want to mention that it's not just these inadvertent limitations of AI we have to worry about, or side effects of the use of data. It's also malevolent uses of AI. There's a concern, I think the commission was quite concerned with potential adversarial attacks on AI systems. If we rely on AI systems, we have components in our operations that provide what we say are attack surfaces. And there's a whole now growing taxonomy of the kind of things you can do to attack an AI system, through poisoning, stealing data, evading system operation, and so on, manipulating in various ways. Another whole area that we're concerned about, that I've been concerned about for a while now, including being involved with the National Academy study, is on AI-enhanced cyber attacks. What might be done there against our nation or by non-state actors within our nation. There's the idea of weaponizing information operations, having malign, weaponizing our open social media, for example, with misinformation and disinformation, to use AI technologies to exploit tensions and enhance divisions. The idea of what nations and governments can know about you with new forms of surveillance, just from public data sets these days with what's called micro-targeting and data harvesting. And that's in our country, we're worried about that, but imagine how these technologies can be used in autocratic nations for oppression. So there's deep concerns with the future of human rights and civil liberties and privacy worldwide.
Well, so how do we ensure moving forward that AI is developed with sort of ethical, democratic, and open society principles in mind? I mean, it is somewhat controversial to say this, but I mean, it's a reasonable question. Is democratic society at a disadvantage because of basically, respect for civil liberties and openness? And I'm happy to go to anyone who wants to jump in between Eric and Missy.
I'll let Eric take this if he wants to, but I think that AI can be useful in some contexts, although deeply flawed, and can open the door to bad actors. And I just dropped a link in to a paper in the chat about, this also goes to lethal autonomous weapons. It's easy to take one of the polar opposite views, but the right answer for privacy, for national security is you can't just say no to AI, because there are actually some good elements of it that we want to maintain for national security, for a strong defense. So it's more difficult than it sounds.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment that the issues around what it means to the automation of technologies that are edging into the realm of human intellect for decision-making and automating various kinds of tasks that have traditionally been the domains of human cognition, raises all sorts of interesting questions that cut to the our values and to who it is that we are as a nation and like-minded nations. So in our report, we talk deeply about federal agencies needing to apply AI in ways that are consistent with constitutional principles, due process, privacy, equal protection, non-discrimination, and for diplomacy, standing firm against uses of AI by authoritarian regimes to repress individual freedoms, and thinking about even bringing together like-minded nations when it comes to setting the standard on norms for the world in opposition to an alternate view of reality and how technology is applied to take us way beyond what 1984, that novel said about a surveillance state with new kinds of efficiencies.
So how do we make sure though, or at least, I mean, it's impossible to really make sure, but, how do we take steps to not essentially have, the equivalent of disinformation crisis that we're facing at the moment? I mean, I imagine that, when ARPANET was first being deployed, we didn't think it was going to be misused to basically subvert entire populations. So what do we do now? What do we do today, especially given this attention to artificial intelligence, to mitigate some of those risks?
Again, back to the reflection, there's issues around holding true to rule of law and democratic values in our systems, and this has implications for how we build and test the systems. Back to Missy's earlier comments, we need to think through robust and reliable systems, come up with ways to test them. We need to also think through deeply accountability and governance. How do we extend the current accountability when it comes to the life cycle of these systems and how they're used, and policies for their governance? when it comes to your question directly, on how do we avoid some of the applications we're seeing, such as use of AI and related technologies combined with social media, for example, to manipulate and misinform. This is a broader question which extends beyond AI in some ways. So we all know right now that AI is being used along with modern graphics to synthesize media, synthesize events that are hard to tell from real events, and false flags and various kinds of alternate realities can be built, threatening to put us in a post-epistemic world, a world where we can't trust any news. Might AI help there? Well, yes, there's applications of AI technologies that have been applied to detecting synthetic media, to detecting various kinds of manipulation. But we have to also look outside of AI, because AI technologies that are trying to detect synthetic media are going up against AI technologies using the same methods that are trying to bypass them. And that's going to be a situation where we cannot rely on AI to tell the difference between synthetic and non-synthetic media, for example, as one direction. And we have to move to other kinds of methods, like the authentication of media provenance through cryptographic methods that are now being talked about, to understand when the source of media came from a real world event, for example, or a trusted news agency, and has not been modified since in the chain of baton passing.
I would like to go over to Missy and just kind of start the conversation of where do we go from here? And I'm sensitive to the comment in the chat that we're trending pessimistic, which maybe is appropriate given this is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. But I'm curious, what are you optimistic about? And is there some of the ways to mitigate some of these challenges as we move forward? And we're about 3 minutes from taking people's questions.
Well, I'm optimistic in general. I'm a futurist, right? All this technology development is good. And as soon as we make one discovery, it's like any technology, we define great technology, somebody defeats it. Then we build another technology, somebody builds a technology to answer that. So if I take the 30,000 foot view, look, this is what we do. This is what technology developers do. So I'm encouraged that there is goodness in technology, but all technologies, regardless of whether or not we're talking about AI, can be abused. To me, and this is trending a little bit pessimistic, but I think that the bigger problem to addressing this is education and what I call technical literacy when it comes to AI and really anything about a computer. I believe that in this country that we should make all community college computer science classes free for everyone, because this country is desperately in need for people who can speak intelligently about computers just in generally, but more specifically about artificial intelligence. I cannot tell you, I hang around with a ton of C-suite people, and it drives me insane how many people who are rich and famous and educated and all these other things, the stuff that comes out of their mouth about what AI can and can't do and what people think is AI, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet, it's maddening, right? So we need to really focus on technical literacy when it comes to computers and related technologies, because without that technical literacy, we can't solve these problems. We can't identify them. I worry about this for the US government, and I've been on the record multiple times saying the biggest problem the US government, particularly the Department of Defense, but also the Department of Transportation has, is that they don't have anybody on staff who really fundamentally understands what's going on in these systems so that they can define it, identify it, mitigate problems, look at the right paths for the future. So we have a huge technology competency gap that we need to fill in this country across all settings.
Can I just say that for the comment about trending negative, I'm extremely optimistic about how humanity will press AI into service. We need along the way to address rough edges and some sharper edges, like any technology, as Missy said, with how these technologies can be used, whether it be inadvertent costs as well as malevolent uses. So the upside for healthcare, education, transportation, scientific discovery, we're already seeing just breakthroughs in scientific discovery using AI methods, climate, material science, designing new materials and designs and optimizations with AI, and even personal well-being will be just deep and impressive. Here's one example. I just gave this talk to a set of physicians. About 5 years ago, a Johns Hopkins study showed that over 250,000 people each year are dying because of avoidable medical error in hospitals. That was trending at the time, in 2016, right after heart disease and cancer. Now, unfortunately, COVID is number 3, at 500,000 and beyond deaths. But the idea of applying AI carefully to, for example, provide safety nets to help people minimize their errors in hospitals, or to detect infection disease likelihood, or even a system we built a number of years ago to detect that a patient being discharged will be readmitted in 30 days. Avoidable readmissions has been found to be a $17.5 billion challenge to Medicare. So there's even basic applications done well can go a long way.
Well, to be honest, I am actually insanely optimistic precisely because we are pessimistic, because I do think technology is opportunity opening and expanding, and there's so many things that we can do better with AI, but I think that caution is appropriate precisely at this inflection point. So I'm really happy with this conversation. I'm going to pass it over to Hallie to just remind everybody about the next section of the program, and then we'll go to questions.
Nadya. Hello again. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner, and I am the program manager here at the Bulletin. We do ask that you please keep yourself on mute throughout the program, unless you are called on for a question. But please keep your cameras on, as we are striving to build community, and all of you are members of that community. If you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please use the raise hand function. Our moderator will see that and call on you. You can find this by clicking on the participants button or the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, depending on your setup. Please do not physically raise your hand. There are too many participants for us to recognize you that way. Also, please note that we have many folks on the call, so we apologize in advance if we did not get to your question. If you've already raised your hand, rest assured we see you. A recording of this program will be also available on our website in the coming days. Back to you, Nadya.
Great, thank you so much. So Harrison Prosper has a question, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. This is really very interesting and very exciting, I think, for our future for sure. But one of the question I have is actually about whether or not the problem is the technology per se, or whether ultimately the problem is people. Let's take, for example, an amazing technology, the book, right? The printed book. This has led to Shakespeare and amazing things. It's also led to Mein Kampf, and so I think it is inevitable that in a species like ours there'll be bad actors, and so it seems to me that the only way we can actually mitigate the problems is, as Missy said, education. In the end, that's the only thing that saves us from going over the edge. And so I want to know if we're serious about it, what's the very first step that we need to do?
Well, I would just like to give you a very tangible don't going forward. After today, please do not weave in the phrases machine learning, deep learning, big data, and Bitcoin all together, right? I mean, I would really like people to sit before they start to pontificate about how they think their self-driving car or their Tesla, which is not a self-driving car, but has a capability called full self-driving. I mean, ask yourself, do I really understand what is happening in this technology? And am I a proponent of a technology because I want it to be true? Or do I really understand what this technology is or is not doing for me? So I would really like people to sit back and have more deconstructionist thinking. I realize, I mean, that's a tall order. I think we live in such a fast-paced information on demand society. And, this goes back to this idea of education. We've got to teach people to think before they act or tweet or approve funding for that program that doesn't make any sense, et cetera.
Great. So let's go to our next question. And if you don't mind, if you can introduce yourself. So let's go to Jeffrey Aronson. You are on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Technologically,
Yeah.
so to speak. Do any of y'all anticipate that there are going to be systems that are going to be coming online very soon that are going to take this horrible thing that we've got about having to write these crazy algorithms for thousands of people and make them all work and fairly and things like that, and move to a system where we're making AI that are uniquely for each person? It's personalized. Your speech recognition is personalized. Your health metrics monitoring is personalized. Just every service that you have and everything that's within those services are completely secure and private, because you have identity tests that locks everybody else out constantly.
I think that's a beautiful vision you're painting, Jeffrey, of a future where there's a whole area of AI advance that's aimed at deep personalization and deep support of the health and well-being and decision-making of individuals, where data mining, data analysis, and data collection can largely even be leveraged all in the privacy of a person's own computing bubble, not even call to the cloud or call outside. There's already some interesting work going on when it comes to, for example, monitoring people that are at risk of atrial fibrillation for when they might be in danger. New kinds of personalization for diabetics, for controlling blood sugar in very, very precise new ways based on learning about the individual. You can imagine technologies that would figure out beyond standard human limitations what your limitations in memory and your preferences are, and augment your cognition when needed, reminders of various kinds and so on. Those technologies are already happening. We're already doing personalization of various kinds in end user systems for email, for commitment recognition. I think there are already startups doing some personalization work on healthcare related topics. So it's a great vision, and I think there'll be a big space of creativity and opportunity in the space that you laid out, actually.
I just wanted to add real quick, I'm actually working on a project right now funded by the United States Navy, where we are learning how to use AI to recognize when people have gone through a novice stage to achieve expertise. And so you can imagine this is a kind of personalization that allows, some pilots need longer time to get to be a good pilot. Some pilots need shorter time, and we can save a lot of money by making sure we understand when people have achieved the right cognitive states. So just like Eric was saying, that is a fantastic use of AI, and I am very, very optimistic about the human autonomy teaming aspect, where we use AI to augment humans instead of replacing them.
I think there's also opportunities to mitigate some of the privacy risks, because you don't have to centralize the data processing and focus on the individual. So maybe let's go to Harry Wingo. And again, if you can introduce yourself and then go to your question.
Hey, thanks, Nadya, and great program. I'm Harry Wingo. I'm at the National Defense University at the College of Information and Cyberspace, the nation's cyber college. Missy, I'm so proud of you. You're my classmate, and I couldn't be more proud of what you're doing. Hoo-yah. And Eric, thanks for your contributions. I have a question about digital twin technology. National Institute of Science and Technology here in the United States, Department of Commerce just put out requests for comments by 16 June. And that also, digital twin, I'm just curious how you see that to potentially be a platform for, one, gaining more inputs from human beings, in our insights, to put AI in context or help develop that. So how could digital twin help? And then also, is it possible that if done at scale, kind of in a serious gaming type of way, that you could end up M-Turking some of the privacy concerns, ethical concerns, and I know there are digital twins out there. I'm just curious what you think about the potential for digital twin to accelerate us towards next generation or more contextual AI. Thank you very much for what you're doing.
Thanks, Harry. The National Security Commission on AI certainly called NIST out for doing many things for requirements moving forward for helping us to field robust and reliable AI systems. On digital twin, this is the idea, basically, for those that haven't heard that phrase before, is to build a high fidelity simulation of a system in the world, and then using that system to generate data, do testing, do faster time constants to get ahead of the real world, and so on. In many ways, it's early days for that kind of thing because it's really hard to build real digital twins given the complexity of the open world. But simulators are pretty good and they're getting better. And we're seeing already really tantalizing work in generating and learning from machine learning large data sets generated by what you might call a digital twin or a simulator of the actual system you're building, and then testing and training for tasks inside the simulated world, and then going out to the real world. Now, what we've found in some of our of what we call sim to real mappings is once you do that for the application of training in this world and then going out into the real world, into training in the simulated world, is you have to sort of figure out where the blind spots and where the system's rough edges are, and then do spit polish with real world work. So it can help us make a leap ahead, but it's not all the way typically.
Well, and Harry, you got, that's one of my trigger words, digital twin. I am all about simulations. I've spent a good part of my professional careers in academic building simulations. I think there's some good areas of application of digital twins. I just finished a project with Pfizer on vaccine fermentation, how to automate that process. It's actually a lot trickier than you think. And so that kind of control process where you have access to closed systems is a great area for digital twinning to allow you to do some experimentation that would otherwise be maybe too dangerous or too expensive and just not possible to do. However, __, digital twinning is actually can only take you so far in safety critical systems. Let me make that hammer as big as I can. We cannot use digital twins to answer whether or not self-driving cars are going to be safe in the real world. And we absolutely cannot use digital twins for any kind of weapons testing, lethal or otherwise, right? Because the military, it's all about the fog of war. Digital twins cannot handle high degrees of uncertainty. And so they can take you a little ways to maybe get your system designed and know you've got some set parameters, but when you're doing high uncertainty domains, fog of war, lots of problems that you could face that could kill people, digital twinning will not take you to that point.
You definitely have some fans with us here at ASU at the Center for Human AI Teaming on the hammer. I see Robert Gutwiler in the chat. Let's go to Gary Goldstein.
Hello, thank you for this opportunity to hear so much more about AI. This is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is initially concerned about nuclear weapons. And I would like to hear from especially those of you who are involved in national security, to what extent is our nuclear weapons system, our ICBMs, our submarine launched missiles, et cetera, dependent now on AI systems, and how, and particularly, I'm worried about first strike weapons that are going to strike before anyone has a chance to make a decision, a human decision.
Yeah, let me just say that. Thanks for the great question. So one of the important recommendations in the NSCAI report was that we recommended that the U.S. clearly and publicly affirm as existing U.S. policy that only human beings can authorize the employment of nuclear weapons, and importantly, to seek similar commitments from Russia and China. I think that it's a forward-leaning statement, but given the rise of concern and interest in automation and the potential pressures for countries to go on alert to have various kinds of automation and pattern recognition in that loop, we need to sort of weigh in when it comes to high stakes situations like that and say, as the country, this is not recommended. Only human beings should be authorizing these weapon systems, and let's get agreements internationally on that.
Let's go to Patrick. Is it Zond?
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a remark and a question. And thank you for organizing. I'm a fan of the Bulletin. And that's why I make the first remark and then I will ask my question. The first remark, I'm not an American. And I thought that the Bulletin was a global organization. And I face a very US-centered discussion, we and our national interest. I know no national interest. I know only the human global interest. There is no national interest, including with nuclear weapons, that can just be discussed compared to when we face existential threats that the Bulletin is informing us week after week that and that we cannot oppose any kind of national interest. I know your country well, and I'm presently in Mexico. I know your country well, and I recognize this very centered and sometimes unbearable type of exchange. To me, we have to stick to the ambition of the Bulletin. My question is the following about autonomous weapons. I'm absolutely not a fan of technology unless humans are, and philosophers and the societies see human progress. When we face existential threats, we should be very careful. And I invite you to read the book of Mr. Harari, which is Homo Deus, about and also as a former diplomat, I can say that the lethal autonomous weapon system is stuck because also the US is opposing their prohibition and oppose the idea that in the definition of such weapons, there is a requirement of meaningful human control, not only for nuclear weapons, to answer Mr. Horvitz, but also for any kind of weapon. The fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, starting with distinction, proportionality, precaution, and attack, must be complied with. This is absolutely indispensable. The US is opposing this because they want to have a strategic advantage in having such weapons on the battlefield. The second are the laws of humanity, which is the philosophical and ethical issue to prohibit such weapons. And third, the dictates of the public conscience. It means that people like me, and the huge majority of people in the world.
Sir, is there a question in there to our panel?
Yeah, the question is, why do you think that the US is opposing the prohibition of lethal autonomous weapon system within the present governmental experts
I think
group?
this is, so I guess I would just to kind of move on, make sure we have time to wrap up the conversation. I think this is a bit above my pay grade. Certainly, I am not the secretary of anything in the US. I do find that the National Security Commission on AI had fantastic recommendations on State Department leadership and technology and a strong technology diplomacy component. Is there anything there, Eric, you would like to comment on?
Well, so first of all, let me thank Patrick for his comments and his reflection and concerns. They're shared concerns. I would absolutely love, Patrick, if you would read the chapter 4 of the National Security Commission on AI report. I'm happy to even talk to you one-on-one about the reflection about automation of various kinds in weapon systems and what are steps forward, including how do we basically understand how to verify weapons, have agreements moving forward. I thought it was a very good discussion the commission had. Everybody cares. And we weren't pushed in any strange way by any power. We reached out to the Europeans. We reached out to people active in UN with the laws discussions. I looked at the history, looked at the weapons that have already been created over the last several decades, looked at how they operate, and human accountability and consistency with IHL, international humanitarian law. So I'd love to just, I think that commission did a good job with directions forward and an analysis. It's a starting point for discussion for sure, but I thought the clarity was there, and it'd be great to discuss more about what are best maneuvers we could take as human beings around the world.
And it was also front and center in all the National Security Commission and AI public briefings. It was much care was taken to that topic. I think we have time for one more question. So I actually wanted to pull one from the chat, which I thought was interesting, and maybe go to Missy with this one. Is explainable AI actually possible? So I'm curious as to your thoughts on that question. We've had a lot of really good conversation on education, but I wanted to pull on that a little bit more. And the question was, I think, from Dennis Wong in the chat, and I apologize if I got that wrong.
Yeah, I always think this is an interesting discussion because it really depends on who we're talking about. Explainable to who, right? Are we talking about, can I develop my AI for our expert versus novice and explain it to Eric? Oh, sure. I'd be a little afraid to. He'd probably poke it full of holes, right? But then if I tried to explain it to my mom or, you know, a lady walking on the street, I try to explain to her that's different, right? So I do think that a lot is lost in the context of who cares matters. I am concerned that we're not doing enough to make sure that we can develop sensitivity analyses. Really, that's more, I think, of the issue, to understand where do these algorithms break down? Where are these points of brittleness and fragility that you heard Eric talk about? And how do we know when to develop the right bumper guards to make sure that we don't lose control of the AI for whatever reason that we're talking about? So I do think that's a loaded word. I do think that we can do a better job of explaining where AI can go wrong.
Great, thank you for that. So we're just almost about at time. So are there any closing remarks that Eric and Missy would like to make? And I'll go to Eric first. And before I do that, just huge thanks to Bulletin of Atomic Scientists for this event and inviting us, and also really appreciate the participation and great questions. So Eric, then Missy, and then I'll hand it off to Haley.
Yeah, just in brief. Artificial intelligence research is exciting and interesting. It's pushing us in new directions. We're learning a lot about what intelligence might be. We're still in the early days. I expect surprises, and therefore we need to monitor carefully the technology and how it's applied. At the same time, we need to be open-minded and creative as to coming up with valuable applications. There'll be so many. I think the future will change dramatically based on new kinds of automation, some of which coming from advances in AI. I do think that we're in the early days of AI. We're even in earlier days when it comes to human AI collaboration. We need to invest more in that area. I think Missy and I will agree deeply about that. But I see great payoffs coming, keeping track of and on top of the rough edges and some sharp edges.
Missy?
Yeah, I totally agree with Eric. I am very passionate about this area because I understand how important the role of the human is. And I said it earlier, but let me reiterate one more time. I think the right path going forward is developing collaborations between humans and artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. This idea of replacement, machines fighting war, no. Machines driving cars completely by themselves without any human supervision, no. So I am the champion for the human in the AI system. And I'm not the only one. I would obviously point to Eric, but there are many of us who are trying to fight the onslaught of just misinformation. it's bookended. People are either think AI is way more capable than it is, or people think that these are all killer robots, and neither one of these are true. The answer is somewhere in between. And so I would actually reach out and ask everyone for your support, whether it's through political bodies or education bodies. Education is the key going forward to AI and to a better understanding of technology just in general.
Thank you so much. Haley, passing it off to you.
Thank you.
Hear you. Oh, there you go.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Eric and Missy for this interesting conversation, and to Nadya for shepherding us through it. Stay tuned for our May 27 virtual program on the United Kingdom's new nuclear posture, what it means for the global nuclear order, featuring the Federation of American Scientists Hans Christensen and MIT Heather Williams in conversation with the Guardian's Julian Borger. And last but not least, thank you to all of you, members of the Bulletin's community, for participating with us this last hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.
Thank you.